17 January 1917. Approximately 2:10 in the morning, near Lens, France. The German sentry cannot see the Canadians. That is the problem. In daylight, no man's land is a wound stretched between two armies. Mud, broken wire, shell holes filled with black water, splintered timber, bodies half buried where they fell. Nothing should be able to cross it unnoticed. At night, everything changes. The ground disappears. Distance becomes uncertain. And the sentry has to do something harder than look. He has to listen. Wind moves through the wire. Water drips somewhere below the parapet. A distant artillery piece fires. Seconds later, another gun answers farther down the front. Then, silence again. The kind of silence that is never truly silent. A rat moves. A loose strand of wire shifts. Mud settles into a shell hole. And somewhere beyond the German trench, another sound appears. Small. Metal against metal. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. The sentry reaches for the flare. A shot. Then light. For a few seconds, night becomes white. The flare hangs above no man's land. Wire suddenly has shadows. Shell holes have edges. Every broken post becomes visible. The German machine gunners look outward. Anything moving now can die. So the Canadians do not move. That is the discipline. A man halfway across no man's land may be lying in water. His hands may be inside the wire. His face may be pressed into mud. But when the flare rises, movement becomes more dangerous than discomfort. Freeze. Wait. Let the German eyes pass over you. Then the light weakens. The flare falls. The battlefield disappears again. Darkness returns. And now the sentry faces the question every raiding party wants him to ask too late. Was the ground empty? Or did the men crossing it simply stop moving before the light found them? By 1917, Canadian trench raids have become carefully planned operations. Some seek prisoners. Some seek intelligence. Some destroy machine gun posts or dugouts. Some are meant to keep pressure on the enemy even when no major offensive is underway. They do not always begin with a huge bombardment. They do not always announce themselves with thousands of men. Sometimes the first warning is a grenade landing inside the trench. That is the difference. Artillery is terrifying because everyone knows when it has arrived. The earth moves. The trench shakes. The noise becomes impossible to misunderstand. A raid creates a different kind of fear. The possibility that the battlefield appears quiet because the enemy is still far away, or because he is already close. The guns tell you when a battle has begun. The Canadian raiders want you to realize it too late. Western Front, 1915 to 1917. The great battles dominate memory. Ypres, the Somme, Vimy. Hill 70. Thousands of men moving. Artillery firing for hours or days. Entire divisions ordered forward. But between those battles, the front does not sleep. It only becomes smaller. A German soldier may spend weeks in one sector without seeing a mass Canadian attack. That does not mean he is safe. There are snipers, mortars, machine gun bursts, artillery harassing known routes, working parties repairing wire, listening posts pushed beyond the main trench, and patrols crawling into no man's land after dark. Night belongs to whoever can move quietly enough. The battlefield changes after sunset. In daylight, men can judge distance. At night, sound becomes more important than sight. Boots dragging through mud. A wire strand vibrating. A whispered order. The scrape of equipment against a wooden post. A sentry may hear something and still not know whether it is a man. German patrols go out. British patrols go out. Canadians go out. Sometimes they pass each other without knowing. Sometimes two patrols meet at distances so close that the fight is over before anyone farther away understands what happened. At first, many of these missions are reconnaissance. Inspect the enemy wire. Find gaps. Learn whether repairs have been made. Listen for movement. Identify new machine gun positions. Then the purpose changes. Instead of looking at the German trench from outside, men are ordered to enter it. That is the raid. Get through the wire. Reach the trench. Strike quickly. Capture someone if possible. Destroy what can be destroyed. Then leave before the German response becomes overwhelming. From late 1915 onward, Canadian units increasingly use this kind of operation. Not because it is safe, because commanders believe it can produce information and keep troops aggressive between larger offensives. For the men ordered to do it, the logic may feel different. No man's land is dangerous even when no one is shooting. Mud can trap a boot. Wire can catch equipment. A flare can reveal an entire party. If the alarm goes up too early, machine guns can sweep the route home. Artillery can be called onto the ground behind the raiders. The German trench may be reached successfully and still become the beginning of the worst part. Getting back. That is what makes trench raiding so strange. The objective may be tiny. The risk is not. A major attack might send thousands of men to capture a ridge. A trench raid might send dozens into the same darkness for something much smaller. Sometimes, one German soldier alive. To understand trench raiding, forget territory for a moment. Forget the map. Forget the idea that every attack exists to move the front line forward. Sometimes the Canadians cross no man's land because they want one man, alive. Artillery solves problems through destruction. A battery can smash a trench, cut wire, collapse a dugout, suppress men long enough for infantry to move. But artillery cannot answer questions. Which German regiment is holding this sector? Has a fresh battalion arrived? Has an exhausted one been replaced? Are reserves moving closer? Has the enemy changed the local defensive system? A prisoner can answer some of those questions, sometimes directly, sometimes simply through his uniform, insignia, papers, or unit identity. That makes one German soldier potentially more valuable alive than several dead. And it changes what victory looks like. A large infantry assault wants the trench. The Canadians capture it, hold it, reinforce it, and move the line. A raid may want nothing permanent. The raiders can enter the German position, take a prisoner, destroy a machine gun, throw grenades into a dugout, and leave. By the time German reserves arrive, there may be no Canadian trench to counterattack, no captured ground to retake. The Canadians are already crawling back across no man's land. That makes the raid frustrating from the defender's perspective. The German commander may stop the larger battle by moving reserves forward. But how do you counterattack an enemy who never intended to stay? The raid is designed around time. Get in. Do the job. Get out. Before the local defense fully wakes up. Before artillery cuts the withdrawal route. Before machine guns are turned toward the gaps in the wire. Before the flare finds the men in the open. The weapons reflect that purpose. Grenades are crucial because trench corners and traverses make long-range rifle fire less useful at close distance. Pistols can be easier to handle in confined spaces. Rifles still matter. Bayonets matter. Knives and trench clubs existed in the brutal close-quarter environment of raiding. None of that should be romanticized. Trench fighting at night is not elegant. It is confused, fast, personal. A man may encounter an enemy at a distance measured in feet rather than yards. The entire mission can become violence in darkness, followed immediately by a desperate attempt to disappear. And still, the real objective may remain one prisoner, one identity, one piece of information, one answer that helps explain what lies beyond the German parapet. That is the paradox of the trench raid. The physical objective can be tiny. The psychological effect can be larger. German sentries now know that Canadians may cross no man's land without trying to launch a major attack. They may come for one position, one prisoner, one night, and then vanish. In November 1915, near Petite Douve Farm, the Canadians showed just how effective that idea can become. Night of 6 to 7 November 1915, near Messines, Belgium. The Canadians are not moving toward Petite Douve Farm to begin a major offensive. They are not trying to hold kilometers of ground. They are trying to enter the German position, strike fast, take prisoners, gather what intelligence they can, and get back before the Germans can organize a full response. That sounds simple when written on a map. At night, in mud, under wire, with sentries listening for every sound, it is not. The raiding party has to cross no man's land first. That means every earlier problem returns. Mud, shell holes, wire, flares, machine guns. The difference is that this time, the Canadians are not just observing the enemy line. They are going inside it. The raid is carefully prepared. Routes are studied. Tasks are assigned. Men know who is supposed to cut wire, who throws grenades, who watches the flanks, who searches for prisoners, who covers the withdrawal. This matters because surprise alone is not enough. Once the first grenade explodes, stealth disappears. From that moment, the raid becomes a race against the German reaction. For the German sentry, the first seconds matter most. If he detects movement early enough, the alarm can spread. Flares rise. Machine guns open. Men deeper in the trench wake and move forward. Artillery can begin falling across the routes the Canadians need to escape. But if the raiders get through the wire before the warning becomes organized, the balance changes. Suddenly, the German defense is reacting from inside its own trench. The Canadians enter. The fighting is short range, confused, violent. Trenches are narrow. Traverses break lines of sight. A man around one corner may have no idea what is happening 10 meters away. Grenades become more useful than long-range marksmanship. Speed becomes more useful than formation. There is no room for a clean battlefield, only sections of trench, one corner at a time. The Canadians kill and capture German soldiers. They do not stay. That is the important part. The trench itself is not the prize. The information is. The prisoners are. The experience is. And once the mission is complete, the Canadians begin withdrawing before the local German response can build into something larger. By the time reserves arrive, the raiders may already be back in no man's land. This is what makes the raid psychologically different from a normal assault. There is no clear front line to recover. No Canadian position sitting inside the German trench waiting to be counterattacked. The violence arrives, then disappears. Petite Douve becomes one of the early Canadian raids remembered for its audacity. It helps establish something dangerous, the idea that these operations can work. And once commanders believe they can work, they start asking for more. More raids, more prisoners, more intelligence, more pressure. The success creates its own problem. The Germans will learn. The darkness will become more closely watched. The sentries will listen harder, and the Canadians will have to become better at disappearing. There is no real way to become invisible in no man's land. The Canadians can only become harder to notice. That difference keeps them alive. Before a raid begins, men may study the enemy wire for nights. Where is it damaged? Where has it been repaired? Which section can be cut quietly? Which shell holes are deep enough to hide in? Which route will still exist when German artillery begins falling? The raid itself may last minutes. The preparation can take much longer. Some raiders darken their faces. Canadian War Museum imagery from the Avion sector shows men returning from raids with faces blackened, likely with burnt cork. The purpose is practical. A pale face can catch moonlight. A flare can turn skin into something visible against mud and clothing. The Canadians are not trying to look frightening. They are trying not to be seen. Equipment becomes a problem too. Anything loose can make noise. Metal touches metal. A canteen strikes a buckle. A rifle catches on wire. A shovel handle hits a post. In daylight, those sounds mean nothing. At night, 20 meters from a listening post, they can destroy the entire mission. So movement becomes deliberate, slow, patient, until the moment patience is no longer useful. Then comes the flare. The German sentry sees something, or thinks he does. A flare rises. For a few seconds, the raider's instinct has to fight his body. Do not run. Do not crawl faster. Stop. Even if the mud is freezing, even if a wire strand is under your chest, even if the man beside you is half exposed, movement catches the eye. Stillness may not. The German gunner searches the ground. Nothing obvious. The light fades. The flare drops. Darkness returns. Move again. A few meters. Stop. Listen. Move. The entire crossing can become a rhythm. Darkness. Movement. Flare. Stillness. Darkness. Movement. The wire is one of the worst moments. Cutting it quietly is harder than cutting it quickly. The cutters bite metal. A strand shifts. Sometimes the raiders have already prepared gaps earlier. Sometimes engineers or wire parties help. Every raid is different. But the principle remains the same. The Germans must not understand where the real danger is until the Canadians are too close for the usual response to be comfortable. Once the first grenade goes in, everything changes. Stealth is over. Now speed takes its place. Grenade parties move through the trench. Others watch communication trenches. Prisoner parties look for men who can be brought back alive. Covering groups protect the exit. The entire raid has to function like a small machine. One part fails and the others may never get home. That is why the Canadian reputation cannot be reduced to aggression. Aggression without planning gets men killed. The successful raid depends on restraint before violence, patience before speed, silence before noise. And every successful raid teaches the Germans something too. The next night, they will be listening harder. By 1916 and 1917, the Germans are not waiting blindly. They know raids happen. They know patrols cross no man's land. They know silence can hide movement. And that means Canadian success begins creating its own enemy. Expectation. The German sentry becomes more important. So does the listening post. So do the flares. A sound at the wire is no longer dismissed easily. A flare goes up sooner. Machine guns are trained on likely approaches. Patrols go out to meet patrols. Artillery registration makes withdrawal routes dangerous. The darkness that once helped Canadian raiders now belongs to both sides. German troops raid too. They scout. They patrol. They set ambushes. No army owns no man's land after dark. The first flare can destroy surprise. The second can trap men in the open. Machine gun fire sweeps shell holes and wire gaps. If the German garrison reacts fast enough, the Canadian raiders may have to choose between pressing forward and withdrawing before the mission has really begun. That is one of the cruelest decisions in raiding. Go forward and risk entering an alerted trench. Turn back and risk crossing the same ground while every German gun is awake. Withdrawal may be more dangerous than approach. On the way in, surprise still exists. On the way out, the Germans know the Canadians are there. Flares burn overhead. Machine guns search. Artillery begins falling behind the raiders. A wounded man slows the party. A prisoner slows it too. The objective itself can become weight. The Canadian raid may succeed inside the German trench and still fail in no man's land. This is where German adaptation matters. The defenders do not need to defeat every raiding party at the wire. They only need to delay it. A few seconds. One flare. One machine gun firing at the correct gap. One patrol arriving at the wrong moment for the Canadians. The entire raid can unravel. The more often Canadians raid, the more German soldiers know what to watch for. A disturbed wire strand. A dark shape that seems too still. A sound that stops when the flare goes up. The Canadian reputation for raiding may create unease. It also creates alertness. That forces adaptation in return. If the Germans expect Canadians at night, the Canadians cannot depend forever on darkness itself. They have to vary timing, routes, methods, supporting fire, and eventually, even the most obvious assumption of trench raiding becomes something that can be broken. Raids happen at night, until one does not. 29 July 1916. Ypres-Comines Canal sector. By now, German sentries understand the pattern. Darkness is dangerous. Night patrols can become raids. Wire can be cut under cover of darkness. Flares can reveal men crawling through shell holes. So the German defensive instinct becomes simple. Watch the night. Listen harder after sunset. Expect movement when visibility disappears. Then the Canadians attack in daylight. The 19th Battalion carries out a daylight trench raid in the Ypres-Comines Canal sector. The exact strength, route, and German losses should be checked against the battalion war diary before final production. But the importance of the action is clear. The Canadians are breaking the assumption that makes raiding predictable. Night protects raiders. Daylight exposes them. That should make daylight the worst choice. And that is exactly why it can become useful. A German sentry scanning no man's land during the day expects to see an attack forming. Thousands of men are difficult to hide. Artillery preparation may give warning. Troops gathering behind the line can be observed. A small raid is different. It does not need the same depth, the same frontage, the same preparation. If terrain provides concealment and supporting fire keeps German heads down, a small party can still move quickly enough to strike. The Canadian raiders use that difference. Not darkness, timing, not invisibility, coordination. This is an important evolution. The Canadian trench raiding reputation cannot be built on one trick. If the only method is darkness, German defenders eventually learn the pattern. So the pattern has to change. Night, dawn, daylight, different routes, different objectives. Different artillery plans. Unpredictability becomes part of the weapon. For the German defender, that is frustrating. The sentry had learned to fear darkness. Now daylight does not guarantee security either. The raid can still arrive. A small party can still cross. Machine gun posts can still be attacked. A trench section can still be entered and abandoned before reserves fully understand what is happening. The battlefield is becoming harder to read. The Canadians do not become invincible because of this. Daylight removes much of the concealment that night provides. If supporting fire fails, raiders are exposed. If the German machine guns recover quickly, the open ground becomes lethal. If timing slips by seconds, a carefully planned raid can become a casualty list. That risk is what makes the choice significant. The Canadians are not proving daylight is safer. They are proving that predictability can be dangerous too. And this is where trench raiding begins to change character again. What started as small groups slipping through the wire is becoming more deliberate, more technical, more integrated with artillery, more dependent on reconnaissance. By early 1917, the raid can resemble a miniature battle, not because the objective is larger, because the planning has become far more sophisticated. 17 January 1917, Cité-Calonne sector near Lons. Return to the darkness from the beginning. The flare, the sentry, the mud, the wire. But now look behind the Canadian raiders. There is more happening than the German sentry can see. Reconnaissance has already been done. Routes studied. Objectives assigned. Artillery coordinated. Machine gun support prepared. Special parties given separate jobs. The raid is no longer simply a few aggressive men crossing the front line. It is becoming a system. A Canadian military history study later described the Calonne raid as exceptionally well planned and close to textbook execution. That language matters because it shifts the explanation away from national mythology. The raid is not successful because Canadians are somehow naturally fearless. It works because preparation reduces chaos. Not completely, never completely, but enough. One party may be responsible for the wire, another for grenades, another for securing a section of trench, another for prisoners. Machine guns may cover likely German approaches. Artillery may isolate the objective or prevent reinforcements from moving freely. The Canadians are trying to create a few minutes in which the German local defense is overwhelmed before the wider system can react. That is the essence of raiding. Local superiority, temporary superiority. Then, withdrawal. From the German side, this feels larger than the number of men involved. A sentry detects movement. Then, artillery begins. Machine guns fire. Grenades appear inside a trench. Communication becomes confused. Is this a raid? A reconnaissance in force? The beginning of a larger attack? The German commander may not know immediately, and uncertainty delays reaction. Even a few minutes can matter. The Canadians exploit that delay. They are not trying to hold the entire German position. They are trying to complete specific tasks before the enemy understands the scale of the operation. That makes precision more important than bravado. A raider who runs too far can ruin the plan. A party that stays too long can be trapped. A prisoner who cannot be moved quickly can slow the withdrawal. The operation succeeds only if everyone knows when to stop. This is where the Canadian trench raiding reputation becomes more than a story about violence. It becomes a story about initiative, flexibility, coordination, the ability of junior leaders and small groups to make decisions under pressure. Historian Andrew Godefroy has linked Canadian success in trench raiding with the wider development of those qualities in the Canadian Corps. That does not prove German soldiers universally admired or feared Canadians more than other raiders. But it does help explain why Canadian raiding became part of the Corps' battlefield identity. And still, every improvement creates another temptation. If one raid succeeds, commanders may ask for another. If larger raids produce more prisoners, more intelligence, and more disruption, then larger raiding parties begin to look worthwhile. That is where the danger grows. Because a raid can become so carefully planned that people forget the one thing no plan can remove. The men still have to cross no man's land twice. Night of 8 to 9 June 1917, south of Avion, France. The Canadians go out again. Darkness covers the ground. The wire is ahead, the German trench beyond it, and behind them is the route home. That route matters more than anything. Because crossing no man's land once is dangerous. Crossing it a second time after the enemy knows exactly where you are can be worse. A raid can succeed inside the enemy trench and still become a disaster during withdrawal. The first grenade destroys surprise. The first prisoner slows the party. The first wounded man changes the pace. German sentries are awake now. Machine guns are searching. Flares rise. Artillery can begin falling behind the Canadians. The same shell holes that hid the raiders on the way in can trap them on the way out. On this night, a raid by the 49th Battalion ends with 16 Canadian soldiers reported missing and presumed dead. The exact sequence of the raid and the causes of each loss should not be invented. What is documented is the absence. 16 men go into the operation and do not return to their unit. For their families, the raid does not end when the firing stops. It becomes uncertainty, missing, presumed dead, no grave anyone can point to. Decades later, remains discovered in France help restore two of those identities: Privates Herbert Peterson and Thomas Lawless. Men who had disappeared into the battlefield in 1917 are eventually identified generations later. That fact changes how the raid should be remembered, not as a daring story alone, as human cost. The Canadian raider is easy to mythologize. Darkened face, grenades, wire cutters, a figure moving through the night. But the darkness does not belong to him. The German defender can use it too. A machine gun firing from a position the raider cannot see is just as deadly. A shell landing in no man's land does not care how well the raid was planned. Mud does not care about reputation. Wire does not care about courage. This is also where the Canadian soldiers' own attitude matters. Officers often believed raiding improved aggression, initiative, and battlefield skill. Many ordinary soldiers saw something else. A dangerous mission. Sometimes a terrifying one. Sometimes a mission that risked highly capable men for intelligence, or prisoners that might seem small compared with the cost. The Canadian War Museum notes that some rank-and-file soldiers regarded raids as frightening and even pointless. That tension should remain in the story. The raiders are not fearless. They go because they are ordered, because their unit has a mission, because the intelligence may matter, because the raid may help the next battle. Fear does not disappear. It travels with them. The Germans fear the men approaching through darkness. The Canadians fear the same darkness on the way home. Sometimes the raid works. Sometimes the sentry sees them. Sometimes the machine gun fires first. And sometimes men simply vanish into no man's land and are not found again for nearly a century. They should have seemed like ghosts. They were not. They bled. They disappeared. They died. And still the Canadian Corps kept raiding, because by the summer of 1917, commanders had discovered that a raid could do more than capture a prisoner. It could help deceive an entire enemy formation. 1917. Western Front. Return to the sentry. The same firing step. The same wire. The same darkness beyond the parapet. Only now he knows more than he did before. He knows the Canadians raid. He knows they may come in small groups. He knows they may want prisoners rather than ground. He knows a quiet night does not guarantee a quiet front. And that changes what silence means. Artillery creates fear through certainty. The shell comes. The explosion follows. The earth moves. A man knows he is under attack. He may have seconds to find cover. He may have none, but the danger announces itself. A trench raid works differently. The danger may already exist before the sentry understands it. No huge bombardment. No thousands of men. No obvious warning that this is the night. Only small signs. A wire strand that should not move. Mud disturbed in a place nobody should be walking. A shadow that disappears when the flare rises. A sound that stops the instant he begins listening for it. That is the real psychological difference behind the title. There is no evidence that every German sentry literally feared Canadian trench raiders more than artillery. Artillery remained one of the most destructive and terrifying weapons on the Western Front, but they were different fears. Shellfire threatened the trench from above. Raiding threatened the idea that the trench itself was secure. The German sentry has one job that matters above almost everything else: detect them early. If the flare goes up while the Canadians are still far away, machine guns can search the ground. If the patrol is discovered at the wire, the alarm can spread. If the Canadians reach the trench before the warning becomes organized, the sentry has failed at the one moment when warning matters most. That pressure changes night duty. The man cannot simply watch. He has to interpret. Is that noise wind? An animal? A German patrol returning? A Canadian wire party? A raiding party already 10 meters closer than it was a minute ago? Fire the flare too early and reveal nothing. Wait too long and the flare may illuminate Canadians already at the wire. That is the sentry's dilemma. And the raider depends on it. The Canadian does not need to remain invisible forever. Only long enough. Long enough to cross. Long enough to cut. Long enough to reach the parapet. After that, surprise may disappear. But by then, surprise has already done its job. This is why a raid can frustrate normal defensive logic. The Germans can reinforce the trench. They can counterattack. They can bring artillery down on no man's land. But if the raiders came for one prisoner, destroyed one post and withdrew, the response may arrive after the purpose has already been achieved. There may be no ground to recover. No Canadian force waiting to be pushed out. Only footprints disappearing into mud. By 1917, the German sentry's realization is not that Canadians are supernatural. It is that the front can remain dangerous even when the guns are silent. And soon, Canadian commanders will use that uncertainty for something larger than a local raid. They will use it to help point German attention in the wrong direction. August 1917. Lens, France. The Canadians are preparing for a major battle. But the objective is not exactly where the Germans expect pressure to fall. Lieutenant General Arthur Currie has been ordered toward Lens. A direct assault into the city promises brutal urban and industrial fighting. Instead, Currie focuses on the high ground north of Lens, Hill 70. Take the hill. Force the Germans to counterattack uphill. Use Canadian artillery and machine guns to destroy those counterattacks. The plan is much larger than anything a trench raiding party can accomplish. But trench raids become one small part of making it work. Before the attack, Canadian forces conduct raids south of Lens. That direction matters. If German commanders see Canadian activity there, they have to decide what it means. Reconnaissance? Preparation? Local harassment? Or evidence that the major Canadian attack will come from the south? Veterans Affairs Canada notes that raids south of Lens were part of efforts to mislead the Germans about the direction of the coming offensive. This is the evolution of trench raiding. In 1915, a raid might cross the wire for a prisoner. By 1917, the location of the raid itself can become information. False information. The Canadians are no longer merely trying to discover what the Germans know. They are trying to influence what the Germans think they know. For a German local commander, the problem is now larger than the Sentries' night watch. Every Canadian action has to be interpreted. Why here? Why tonight? Why this artillery fire? Why this raid? Is the Canadian Corps testing the wire? Looking for prisoners? Preparing the ground? Or deliberately trying to make the Germans look in the wrong direction? The same unpredictability that disturbed one sentry now reaches command posts farther behind the line. On 15 August 1917, the main Canadian attack begins at Hill 70, north of Lens. The Corps moves behind carefully prepared artillery. Canadian troops seize most of their initial objectives rapidly. Then comes the part Currie expects: German counterattacks. Again and again. Veterans Affairs records 21 German counterattacks over the following days. The Canadians hold the high ground at terrible cost. The deception raids did not win Hill 70 by themselves. That point matters. The battle depended on artillery, machine guns, training, reconnaissance, defensive planning, infantry, signals, logistics, and soldiers willing to remain on ground under repeated attack. The raids are one thread inside a much larger plan. But that is precisely what makes them significant. Something that began as a few men slipping through wire has become useful at corps level. The objective has changed. Not one prisoner. Not one dugout. Not one machine gun. Now the raid can help create uncertainty before tens of thousands of men move. The darkness between trenches has become part of operational deception. The German sentry hears a noise and wonders whether Canadians are coming. The German commander sees activity on a map and has to ask the same question. What does this mean? That uncertainty is the real legacy of the raid. Not simply fear, doubt. And in war, doubt can buy time. Night, Western Front. No major offensive tonight. No battalion climbing ladders. No rolling barrage moving toward the horizon. No map changing color before morning. Only trenches, wire, mud, and men listening in the dark. This is where the Canadian trench raiding story belongs. Not only at Vimy, not only at Hill 70, not only in the great battles where entire divisions move. It belongs in the hours between them. From late 1915 onward, Canadian units participate heavily in trench raiding. Some operations are small. Some grow into elaborate miniature battles. Some succeed. Some fail. Some bring prisoners home. Some bring wounded men back. And some leave Canadians missing in no man's land. The Canadian War Museum describes Canadians as developing a reputation for fierceness in trench raiding. That reputation should not be turned into mythology. Canadians are not the only raiders on the Western Front. The Germans raid. The British raid. Other Allied armies raid. No one owns darkness. And no national uniform makes a man immune to a machine gun. What distinguishes the Canadian story is how seriously the Corps comes to use these operations. Prisoners, intelligence, training, aggression, reconnaissance, deception. A raid becomes a small laboratory for skills that later matter in larger battles. Junior leadership, timing, fire support, movement, coordination, the ability to act when the plan begins changing. But there is another side, the men themselves. Some officers believed raids made troops sharper, more aggressive, more confident. Some soldiers saw them as something very different, dangerous, terrifying, sometimes wasteful. The best men in a battalion could be sent into darkness for an objective that might seem painfully small compared with the cost. That disagreement belongs in the history too. Return to Avion. June 1917. 16 men of the 49th Battalion reported missing and presumed dead after a raid. Herbert Peterson, Thomas Lawless. Two names eventually returned to history decades later when remains were found and identified. The raider is not a ghost. He has a family, a hometown, a name. That is why the violence should never become entertainment. Grenades in narrow trenches, knives, clubs, men fighting at distances where faces can be seen. These things happened because trench warfare compressed human beings into fortified lines and then ordered other human beings to enter them. The brutality belongs to the war, not to some mythology that Canadians were naturally more savage than everyone else. And now return one last time to the German sentry. He stands on the firing step. The trench behind him is quiet. Some men sleep. Others wait. In front is no man's land. Nothing moves. He listens. Wind, water, a distant gun, perhaps wire, perhaps nothing. Then he fires the flare. White light spreads across the battlefield. Shell holes, broken posts, mud, wire. No Canadians visible. The sentry watches. The flare begins falling. The light weakens. Darkness returns. He still does not know whether the ground was empty. That uncertainty is the point. Artillery could shatter a trench. It could kill men by the dozen. It could make the earth itself seem unstable. A Canadian trench raid created a different fear. Not the certainty that something terrible was happening. The possibility that something had already begun. The Canadians did not own the night. They simply became practiced at using it. And German defenders became practiced at fearing what might be moving inside it. When the guns were firing, everyone knew the front was dangerous. The guns did not have to be firing for the front to be dangerous. Sometimes the silence